again. I am Pastor Tony still. I say that because when we put this on our website, there won't be the worship time, so it'll just be me. I'm Pastor Tony if you're watching later in life. Welcome to LifeSpring today. Happy Father's Day. Let's start with our quiz. Oh, didn't I tell you there was going to be a quiz this morning? Okay, there's going to be a quiz this morning. Who are these famous fathers? Shout it out if you know the answer. Let's get our first one up here. Who is it? Mufasa. The girls know who it is, but not none of the guys know who it is. Mufasa, that's right. The father who was willing to sacrifice his life for his son. Here's another one. Now, recently, a rare Polaroid was discovered in a cave in Bethlehem. And this is, who's the father? Joseph. Don't say Jesus. Joseph is the father. And he's the earthly stepfather of Jesus. And here's the deal, man. They didn't even share any DNA. You get that? They didn't share any DNA, but Joseph stepped up to the plate to raise the Son of God. How about that guy? He's a good guy. Here's the next guy. Who's this? George Washington, the father of America, our nation, the father of our country, right? I mean, he didn't share any DNA, or at least not too much with all of us, right? But he stepped up and he made sacrifices of just about everything he had to bring this nation into being. Here's an easy one. How about this one? Who's the father? God, that's right. God is the Father. This is Michelangelo's painting of God creating Adam. No, it's not a self-portrait. This is God who created Adam, right? The Father of creation, right? The point is, for this morning, you don't necessarily have to share DNA with your children to be a great father. Fatherhood today is not about having matching DNA. You can match your DNA and not be a father, right? We call those people deadbeat dads, and some of you know too well who I'm talking about. True fatherhood is about love and sacrifice and guidance, right? Our Father is the one shaping our lives, and sometimes that person's a grandfather. Sometimes that person is an uncle or a friend. You know, sometimes that person is a single mom. Sometimes that person is whoever it is that steps up to the plate when you need that person the most. And today we're talking about how to be the best father you can be, with or without matching DNA. We're continuing this morning through the book of Philippians with a special Father's Day lesson called Fabulous Fathers. If your father's here or the father of your children, turn to them and say, "You're fabulous. You're fabulous. You guys are fabulous." Open your Bibles or devices to Philippians chapter 2. Paul's writing to the church in Philippi to introduce a young man that he is sending to visit them. And the man's name, well, there's two men coming, actually. The first man's name is Timothy, and the second man is Epaphroditus. We're going to talk about Timothy first, and Paul describes their relationship as that of a father and a son, even though they don't share any DNA. Even though Laura doesn't share any DNA with me, she gave me a tie for Father's Day. That makes me a father. Anyway, there's a note-taking outline. It's in the program at the back. If you can get one, you can go ahead and grab one. Or it's on your app. It's on the website. If you're at home, you can follow along with our teaching today. And there's also an action plan so you can apply this teaching in your life this week. So let's go ahead and stand, and we're going to read God's Word together today. We're looking at Philippians chapter 2. Beginning in verse 19. We're going to be reading here in the New Living Translation. Read it with me. If the Lord Jesus is willing, I hope to send Timothy to you soon for a visit. Then he can cheer me up by telling me how you're getting along. I have no one else like Timothy who genuinely cares about your welfare. All the others care only for themselves and not for what matters to Jesus Christ. But you know how Timothy has proved himself. Like a son with his father, he has served with me in preaching the good news. Let's pray and see what God wants to teach us today. Father, take your word and use it to transform our lives. By the power of your Holy Spirit in this place today, take the word of God and transform the children of God into the image of God, and show us how to be the kind of parents this world needs, this generation needs. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Go ahead and have a seat this morning. In this letter to the Philippian church, Paul describes his relationship with these two men. He calls his sons in the faith, Timothy and Epaphroditus. Paul actually calls them his sons in the faith. He behaves like a father in the way that he deals with them. So let's see what we can learn about fatherhood from the Apostle Paul and in his relationship with these two men that he brought into the faith and grew up under him as their father, so to speak. And to become the men of God that God created them to be, because that's really what our role is as parents. And the first thing he says is, seek your children's best, right? Seek your children's best. Now, as Paul writes this letter, he is a prisoner in a Roman prison. He's a prisoner in Rome. He can't travel to Philippi, no matter how much he may want to or may like to, he can't go there. So he does the next best thing. He sends Timothy in his place. In 2 Timothy 2:2, Paul says this. He says, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. In Philippians 2:19 and 20, we get to see two generations of this principle play out in Paul and Timothy's relationship. Paul disciples Timothy into a mini Paul. And then Timothy disciples the Philippian church into some mini Timothys and mini Pauls to live out that character that they saw in Paul and Timothy. So much so that when the Philippian church discovers that Paul is in prison in Rome, and when we say in prison, don't think bars and prison cells and stone walls and guard towers and barbed wire. That's not how the Roman government did it. If they had prisoners who were really not like they weren't the head of a band of people that were going to attack, what they would do is they would chain them to two guards. And then it was the prisoner's responsibility to provide for their own shelter, to provide for their own food, clothing, medical care, whatever they need. They had to provide for themselves. Rome thought this was a great idea. Why should we pay for prisoners? Pay for yourself. And so that's what they did. So Paul is under house arrest in Rome. Now, he can't go anywhere and he can't do anything, but he has to provide his own living situation. He has to provide his own food and everything that he needs. So the Philippian church hear about this and they responded and they wanted to participate with what Paul was going through, so they sent a financial gift. And the letter to the Philippians is actually a thank you note. It's actually Paul's thank you note to the Philippian church for sending this financial gift. Now, he says in verse 22, he says, like a son with his father, he has served with me in preaching the good news, talking about Timothy. Like a son with his father. That's Paul talking about his relationship with Timothy. And talking about Timothy's relationship to the church, he says in verse 20, he says, I have no one else like Timothy who genuinely cares about your welfare. Right? As Paul poured into Timothy, Timothy pours into the Philippian church. When I was growing up, people would say I was a chip off the old block. And I don't know how this happened, but my dad walks with kind of a funny gait. He kind of swings his right leg around. Now, not quite that exaggerated, but he does. When he walks, he kind of swings his leg around. And And I remember the first time I heard someone say that about me, and I said, what does that mean? And they said, well, when you walk, you swing your right leg around like your dad. And I don't know where I learned that. I don't know how I picked that up, but that's how I saw my dad walk, so I guess that's how you walk, right? And we say that phrase, he's a chip off the old block. Well, Timothy was a chip off the old block, and the Philippian church was a chip off the old block. Personal discipleship has always been a core value of my personal life and Sylvia's personal life. Since we came to faith in Christ, I've always been mentoring at least one other person in the faith. And I've tried to instill in them the same passion and commitment to Jesus Christ that Christ instilled in me. That's what Christian discipleship is all about. There was a time in our church's history when our nursery director was Chris Johnson, and our elementary director was Jen Pugh. And when we'd get together for staff meetings, I would tell them their job was to make Chris Jens, right? Their job was to make Chris Jens. Their job was to instill their character in their students to the point where there were a bunch of little Chris Johnsons and little Jen Pews running around this church. That's what we're to do. We're to take what God has put in us and we're to impress it on the next generation, on our children and our grandchildren and the children that God brings into our lives. Now, here's the thing, though. Parents always have an image in their own minds of what their children ought to be. And that image is many times a bigger and better version of themselves, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but that's not what God calls us to do. God doesn't call us to make our children into bigger and better versions of ourselves. He calls us to make our children into the image of Jesus. And sometimes our view of what our children ought to be doesn't match up with what God's view of what they ought to be is. I can tell you this, when my youngest daughter came to my wife and I and said, God's calling me to be a missionary to China, we said, no, I don't think he is. No, let me just check. No, that's not what it says, right? But, we had to have a come to Jesus meeting. We had to realize that maybe our vision of her future was not God's vision for her future, and it wasn't God that needed to change his mind. It was us. We have to seek our children's best, and their best is not what we have planned for them. Their best is what God has planned for them. Timothy is with Paul and Silas when they first walk into the city of Philippi. Timothy is there when they're looking around. There's no synagogue. There's no place where the people can congregate except down by the riverbank. That was kind of like the place where people went to pray if there was no synagogue. And so Timothy is there when Paul and Silas go down to the riverbank and run into this gal named Lydia. And they share the gospel with Lydia, and Lydia comes to faith in Christ, and she brings her whole household together so that they can hear what Paul has to say, and they all come to faith in Christ. And Timothy is with Paul and Silas as they're walking through the marketplace, and there is this woman who is tormented by a demon, but she's a slave girl, and the owners of the slave girl, they are making money off of this woman because she's so demonized. And Paul turns to her and casts the demon out of her life, and she's excited, and Paul's excited, and Silas is excited, and Timothy's excited, and the woman's owners are not excited. So they call the magistrate, and they have Paul and Silas thrown into jail. And Timothy watches as they're dragged away and thrown into jail. And Timothy is with the rest of the church at Lydia's house, and they're praying that night that God would do something in Paul and Silas's life. Timothy is there praying his heart out, and an angel appears in the prison and blows open the doors of the prison. This is a regular prison. Blows open the doors of the prison, and Paul and Silas tell all the prisoners, stay where you are. Don't go anywhere. And the jailer, whose job it is, who's responsible to make sure nobody escapes, he comes running in thinking they've all escaped and he's going to kill himself. And Paul says, don't do that. We're here. We're waiting for you. Got something I want to share with you. And he tells him about Jesus. And the jailer puts his faith in Christ and brings Paul and Silas home. They didn't escape. Jailer took them home, and they share with his house, and they become followers of Jesus Christ. And they join the church now that's at Lydia's house. And you can imagine Timothy as he's at Lydia's house praying that for Paul and Silas. And then Paul and Silas come walking through the door with a whole bunch of new converts from the prison. Timothy is watching all of this. Timothy's seeing all of this. Timothy is there. He's not just there to serve Paul. He is there to become more like Jesus. And Paul helps Timothy to become a disciple of Christ. And Timothy, who learns that, turns around and helps the Philippian church. When Paul and Silas leave, Timothy hangs out for a while and helps the Philippian church to become disciples of Jesus Christ. Fathers, I'm speaking to you right now, but I'm also speaking to the moms. Every task you ask your children to do, every responsibility you place on your children, every activity you participate in together is either an opportunity to disciple them in the faith, or it's a distraction from your role as parenting. Every single thing. Whatever it is that you're doing, it's either an opportunity to help them grow in their understanding of who they are and who God is, or it's a distraction from the real work of parenting. And with the exception of outright sin, it almost doesn't even matter what you do. It doesn't matter what the task is. It doesn't matter what the responsibility is. It doesn't have to be church-related. Whatever the opportunity is, it's either an opportunity for growth or an opportunity for distraction. But it's all about how you, dads, frame it. How are you going to frame it? Are you devoted to your job? I hope so. Are you devoted to your family? You better be. Are you devoted to your church? Yeah. Are you devoted to sports? That's okay. Whatever it is you're devoted to, use it as a platform to pass along critical life lessons to your children. Don't simply pass along stats and other information that has no eternal value. Use them as platforms, teaching moments and opportunities. As a father, your role is to integrate your faith and your relationship with Jesus into your everyday lives so your children can see it. And this is a lot harder than just simply laying down the law, right? Because this requires you to be engaged in parenting 24/7. And guess what, guys? That's what we signed up for. That's what we signed up for. When Moses was about to enter the promised land, he gave this challenge to the fathers in Israel in Deuteronomy 6:4. He said, listen, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And you must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to the commands that I bring to you, that I'm giving to you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road and when you're going here, when you're going to bed, when you're getting up, when you're going here, when you're going there. Talk about them all the time. Fatherhood is about transferring a life of faith to your children. And in Hebrew, there's a word for lecturing. Moses doesn't use it here. There's a word for teaching. Moses doesn't use it here. Moses uses a word that simply means conversation. Conversation. You talk to your kids about what you're doing, about where you're going, about what's important. You don't lecture them. You just talk about stuff. You just talk about stuff. Some of you talk to your children about the Dodgers, how they're doing, about their soccer game, about their t-ball game. You don't lecture them. You talk to them. You talk to them about things that are important to you. And if Jesus is important to you, then Jesus becomes a part of every conversation, no matter what it's about. And that's true parenting. When my kids were growing up, I felt this insane pressure to include family devotions at every meal. There was a small group that was going around when my parents were young. It was called Growing Kids God's Way. And it's a great concept, okay? It's a great concept. But, oh my goodness, the pressure that they put on you as a parent, you had to do this. And if you didn't, you were a failure and your kids were going to go to hell. And it was like, oh my goodness, I gotta, and it was, I mean, I'm a pastor. And it was more pressure than I could take. And one of those was this idea of family devotions, and I would buy books, and I would buy workbooks, and I would do this stuff, and I would bring them out at dinner, and my kids would groan. And what happened, I'd get so frustrated and feel so inadequate, I'd just throw in the towel, until I felt guilty enough, because, of course, the people at church would come around and say, oh, man, you wouldn't believe the family devotions I had this week with my kids, and I'm like, And I'd feel guilty enough, I'd start it up again, until I just felt so inadequate, I'd throw in the towel again. And I'd feel guilty enough, I'd start it up again, and then inadequate, throw in the towel again. And this was the roller coaster of my parenting, until I discovered something amazing. At dinner one night, the kids were all excited because a girl, they were in high school at this time, a girl came to school wearing saran wrap. That's what that's what Sylvia and I said. We went, huh? What? Wait a minute. What do you mean? And they're like so excited to talk about this girl who just wrapped herself up in colored saran wrap, and that's what she wore to school. And I said, and that was okay? Well, she pointed out that it didn't violate the school dress code. Okay. And so we engaged in this conversation about this thing that my kids were excited about that happened at school, and we were able to talk, well, what do you think about that? Well, that's not right. Well, why isn't that right? It didn't violate the school dress code. Why wasn't that right? And all of a sudden, they gave a family devotion around our dinner table. And my wife and I looked at one another after dinner and said, wow, if every family devotion could be like that, I would want to do that. And here's what happened. Here's what we learned. We joined their conversation. We joined their conversation about what they wanted to talk about. We asked them what they thought, and we brought Jesus into their conversation and had one of the best family devotions of our lives. And it was unscripted. It was completely unscripted. I learned that the best family devotions happen when you talk about life and you talk about Jesus in the same conversation. And that's all you have to do. That's all you have to do. Throw away the books. Sorry. Throw away the books. Throw away the pressure. Throw away all of the expectations and just talk about life, talk about Jesus, and see what God's Spirit does with the conversation. And talk about the challenges that they're facing. Talk about the challenges that you're facing. That was another thing we learned. Talk about the challenges that you're facing, because one day your kids are going to face challenges, and they're going to need some examples of how godly people face challenges. See, fabulous fathers seek what's best for their kids, not what makes them look good, feel good, sound good, right? Not what we want, what God wants. The second thing fabulous fathers do is sacrifice for your children's good. And Paul now turns our attention to a man named Epaphroditus. His name means belonging to Aphrodite. Aphrodite is the Greek goddess of love. And his name being Epaphroditus implies that the man's parents were devoting him to the goddess from his birth. The preaching of the gospel through the Apostle Paul turned this man's heart from Epaphroditus, the goddess of love, to Jesus, who is love. And when this church heard about Paul's imprisonment in Rome, they knew they had to do something, and what they do is what churches do. They took an offering, right? They took an offering. And then they send Epaphroditus to deliver the gift. They send him, now check this out, right? They send him with a huge bag of money on a dangerous and arduous journey. I want you to check this out. This is a 40 to 50 day journey of 800 miles. It includes a crossing of the Adriatic Sea. Challenges to this journey come from weather, illness, bandits, exhaustion, stress. You got this big bag of money. And listen to Paul describe this man, Epaphroditus. He says, meanwhile, I thought I should send Epaphroditus back to you. He's writing to the Philippian church. I'm going to send him back to you. He is a true brother, a co-worker and fellow soldier. He came as your messenger to help me in my need, and I'm sending him because he has been longing to see you and was very distressed that you heard he was ill. And he certainly was ill. In fact, he almost died. But God had mercy on him and also on me so that I would not have one sorrow after another. Paul leads this life of sacrifice. He sacrificed to bring the gospel to the people of Philippi. He traveled so far from home just to be in Philippi. Excuse me. He was publicly beaten and thrown into jail, not to mention just the hardships of the journey to get there. Epaphroditus learns the value of sacrifice from Paul, his father in the faith. And then he turns around and makes a sacrifice for Paul. He travels from Philippi to Rome pretty much on his own dime. He faces the threat of bandits, this big bag of money, and exposure, right? He so much so that he arrives in Rome sick and at the point of death in order to deliver this gift. I have this image of him crawling across the floor and laying the money down, but he doesn't die. He doesn't die. I mean, think about the people in our quiz earlier. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I should have brought something up here, but I didn't. I'm just getting over this cough. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. No COVID, just cough. All of the pain and none of the honor of having COVID. I don't know. I mean, he sacrifices himself to bring this money to him. Think about the people in our quiz earlier. Mufasa, who's willing to sacrifice his own life for his son. Joseph sacrifices his reputation to take on this woman who, the world thinks that she's done some bad things. Joseph steps in. Can you imagine being the father of the Son of God? Can you imagine? What do you tell your kid? Hey, don't do that. Unless you think you should do that. I don't know. I don't think you should do that. What do you think? Jesus, do you think you should do that? I don't know. What. Help me here. Help me. Tell me what I need to tell you to do. It would be very intimidating. George Washington. George Washington sacrificed everything. Everything. When I forget what city it was, but, Concord, Lexington, one of those. When that city was being torched and burned to the ground because of what the Patriots were doing, he had most of his homes in that city. I don't remember what the city was, but I think that was Lexington. But he had that was where all of his property was, and they're torching it because of him. Okay, you know what? They're just houses. I'm building a country. Willing to sacrifice. Look at what God sacrificed on the cross for his wayward children. Fathers sacrifice for their children. One of the hardest things you do as a father, I believe, is you work hard enough to provide for your family, but you cut it off so that you're not an absent father, right? You work hard and you're there and you do what you have to do, but you cut it off when you would want to do a little bit more, but you cut it off because you want to be there for your children, not just provide for your children. And finding that balance, I think, is one of the hardest things we do as a father. Our country has a terrible crisis right now with absentee fathers, absentee dads. And it's the last thing our kids need from us. I mean, look at these statistics. This is from the National Fatherhood Initiative. This is not a Christian thing. This is a government organization. The absence of fathers in America is leading to 4 times greater risk of poverty, more likely to have behavioral problems, 2 times greater risk of infant mortality, more likely to go to prison, more likely to commit crime, 7 times more likely to become pregnant as a teenager, more likely to face abuse and neglect, drug and alcohol, 2 times more likely to suffer obesity. My dad was there, but I'm just doing it anyway. 2 times more likely to drop out of school. I mean, these are government statistics about the issue of absentee fathers. Now, they've also compiled figures on the presence of a father. And, again, you can go to the website and you can actually see the data, but infant mortality is better, low birth weight, emotional behavioral problems, all this stuff is taken care of if the father is just present in the home. What do your kids really need from you? Show up. Show up. That's what your kids need. Show up with Jesus and let the rest happen. And finally, in order to be a fabulous father, safeguard God's calling on their lives. In sending Epaphroditus back, Paul says this. He says, welcome him in the Lord's love and with great joy, and give him the honor that people like him deserve. For he risked his life for the work of Christ, and he was at the point of death while doing for me what you couldn't do because you were so far away. Think about this. Paul sends Epaphroditus back with this letter. Epaphroditus doesn't know what's in the letter. He's just carrying it back to the church in Philippi. He gets there, he gives it to Luke, who's probably pastoring the church at this time. And then what does Luke do with the letter? He reads it aloud in the church service. You imagine Epaphroditus when it comes to this part, and Paul's just singing his praise and telling him how wonderful he is and all the stuff that he did. Can you imagine how he felt? Make sure you tell your kids when you're proud of them. Make sure you tell your kids when you're proud of them. And make sure you tell everyone else that you're proud of your kids, where your kids can hear. I mean, put one of those "My Kid's an honor roll student at Florey School" on the back of your car, right? Whatever, your kids go, "Oh, Dad." That's what they say. That's not what they feel. Listen to me. This right here, this next line, this is worth the price of admission today. What you celebrate gets repeated. What you celebrate gets repeated. When your children excel at something, go bananas. Go nuts. When they excel at school or sports, jump and scream and shout from the sidelines Make sure they hear you, but not only that, make sure they know you're doing that in front of all those other parents. That's what they care about, right? They're going to say, oh, Dad. Yeah, okay, say whatever you want, but you know what they're feeling. When they excel in the spiritual arena, kill the fatted calf. I mean, seriously, throw a party. Throw a party. You know, one of our moms, for whatever reason, didn't get our emails telling them that her kid was going to be promoted last Sunday. We promoted a bunch of the kids, and her kid got promoted last Sunday, and she didn't know that was going to happen. And she was so upset that she missed it. And the kids come up on the stage, and teacher Nancy reads their names and hands them a little certificate, and they walk across the stage to the other teachers in the next grade level. That's promotion. But this mom was so angry that she missed it. She missed it. She wanted her child to know that this was important to her. When your children excel in the spiritual arena, go crazy and celebrate. Jesus asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? And he gets a bunch of responses. And then Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus practically does a backflip right there in front of the other disciples. He lifts Peter up and says, wow, you're amazing. Now, Jesus knows that Peter didn't figure this out on his own. Peter knows that the Father revealed this to Peter because the Father wanted him to say it so everybody could see it and it could go down in history. But Jesus says, wow, Peter, dude, I'm going to call you Rocky from now on. You're amazing. When your children excel in the spiritual arena, yeah, we know it's God working in them. It is. But throw a party anyway. Throw a party anyway. Make a big deal. What gets celebrated gets repeated. Say that with me. What gets celebrated gets repeated. Bring them to church. Let them see you here worshiping the Lord, paying attention. Let them see you raising your hands. You know, I know sometimes they look at you like they look at me. And they say, oh, come on, you're embarrassing me. You know what? I'm going to be even more embarrassing than this, David said. Right? God is the most important thing in their lives. And if you have to embarrass yourself to make that point, embarrass yourself to make that point. Right? If they miss God, they miss everything. Make a big deal. What gets celebrated gets repeated. Bring them to church, worship the Lord, let them see you doing it, let them see you reading your Bibles at home and praying. And guys, hear me on this. I get to hang out with your kids here. I mean, Sylvia and I and Nancy and Laura, we did the Mother's Day video. We got the kids out there and said, tell me about your moms. And they got to tell us about their moms, and they got to tell us, and they just wanted to keep on talking about you guys. I talked to your kids in Sunday school. I talked to your kids at youth group. You guys are doing well. You really are. You're doing well. The kids here are amazing. You're doing well. Keep it up. And let's take it to the next level. What's at stake is their eternal lives. Don't get lazy. Don't give in. Don't give up. You got this. We got this together. Let's do it. Happy Father's Day, dads. Check out this last video.